Hi, I'm Rebecca, and today we're going to make this unicorn pillow. It's a cute little toy. It can either be a pillow if you stuff it quite flat like this, or you can stuff it more rounded out and make it like a toy. I've seen people do them as horses, unicorns, all kinds of different creatures and animals. So it's totally up to your imagination how you want to decorate it, what colours you want to do it in, whether it has a horn, whether it doesn't, whether it has a mane, whether you add a bigger mane. It's all the decoration is completely up to you, and I'm going to show you how I make this exact one so that you can then make your own. This is the pattern that is linked as a download on the same page as this video. You'll find in here a whole lot of instructions. It tells you what fabrics you'll need, how to cut it out, how to assemble the pattern pieces. So everything you need is in here, or you can follow along with me and I will tell you everything on the video. So there's a couple of things I wanted to show you. The first is the quick glance cheat sheet. This is in all of our patterns and it's just a very quick step-by-step. So if you are an advanced seamstress, you can just skim through this and know how to sew it. If you want more of a step-by-step, you will find instructions that go through literally every single step of how to sew the pattern. In here, they've got photos, and they do take up quite a lot of page and quite a lot of ink. So I strongly recommend, if you are a visual person and you prefer to flick through instructions, to read them on a screen rather than print them out. And then at the the back, you'll find two things. One is a piece of paper where you can have your the child, if it's for a child, or yourself if it's for you. You can colour this in with the different fabrics. I've seen people stick fabric on here. I've seen them colour it in so that you can then get an idea of how you want your finished unicorn pillow to look and what trims and beads and ribbons and anything else you might want to put. So that's the pattern instructions. And then the other thing you will find at the back of the pattern is the pattern pieces. So the pattern pieces come in regular sized paper. So either A4 if you are in pretty much anywhere except Canada or the US, use A4 sized paper. If you are in Canada or the US, you will need the pattern pieces labelled US letter or US. This is the right size letter paper that fits in your home printers. And you just print them out, and this is one sheet of paper here and one sheet of paper here and one sheet of paper here, and you'll find in the instructions that I just showed you a page that shows you how to assemble it. So next I'm going to cut my pattern pieces out. I'm going to cut out everything except my eyelashes and my little nose, because I'm going to show you how we trace those instead later. Something I should have mentioned before is that there is a 1 inch square. Depending on the version you've got, there may also be a 3 inch square. If you want to make sure that the pattern is sized exactly as per what it says on the pattern, make sure to measure this and check that that is exactly 1 inch. Next up, you need to decide what fabrics you want to use for your unicorn. Now, you may recognise this if you've flicked through the instructions. This is the unicorn that I sewed for the instructions all those years ago when we first came up with this pattern, and my eldest daughter sleeps with this. It is very, very much loved. It's had drinks spilled on it. It's been through the wash numerous times. It's been fought over where it got a cut on its neck. It's been drawn on. This is, I think, one of the most loved toys in our house. I wanted to show you it so that you can see what the finished unicorn looks like up close. We have the ears here, because this is where you're going to be picking what fabrics to use. This is the inner ear piece. It is not finished around the edge here, so I have used a felt, and even though this has been through the wash numerous times, this has not frayed. And then we've got the outer ear piece, which is the it's double-sided and it's the actual ear itself, and you've got 2 ears either side of the mane. Now this is the mane. The mane is 2 layers of fabric, and at the join up here I have inserted a little piece of trim. So you could put ribbon, you could put trim, you could do nothing. And then on either side of the mane down here, you can see that I've put a ribbon in. So I'm going to show you a similar version to this, but you could also sew a strip of, maybe I'll do that, we'll see. We'll see how creative I'm feeling when we get to it. But we could put a strip of ribbon along here. I've seen people sew beads into here. If it's for an older child where you're not worried about a choking hazard, or for yourself, you could put diamantes, you could do anything you like to decorate the mane. Then you've got the horn. The whole thing is quite flat. You can see it's a pillow. It is not a rounded toy. You can stuff it. I've seen people stuff them so that they're much wider and fatter. So you can do that, but it is designed as a pillow. So this horn is stitched flat into the seam up here. It is not, it's flat at the bottom and it does flap around a lot. I've used a felt here and you can see that I've stitched that on to hold it so this doesn't come off. And then you've got the fringe. Now I've seen people do the fringe, not do the fringe. I think it looks a little bit odd without the fringe, but if you're doing a horse, you might do a exaggerated fringe with no horn. I've also seen people put wool into here instead of a mane, completely up to you. This little fringe though, it's a little rounded piece of fabric and it is double-sided, and then it is just tacked down there. Now this is the little nose, it's a tiny little heart and it's stuck on either side, and I've used felt and stitched it on. It does not have a seam allowance. And then you've got the eyes. Now the eyes here I've done felt and stitched them on, and you can see after many years of being used that felt is now wearing thin, but the felt on the nose where it's a bigger piece is not. So as you're making your choices of fabric, those are the things I would consider. I'm going to cut out now. This is the body piece. I need to cut two, which is one mirror image pair, which means I want one that's finished this way and one that's finished that way, and that way they can be the front and the back. The easiest way to do this is to place your fabric right sides together and then cut the two pieces at once. That way when you open it up, you'll have that one mirror image matching pair. I've got these little pattern weights I'm going to use to hold my pattern pieces down. This is our free DIY pattern weight pattern that you'll find in the same section on the website. If you go to rebecca-page.com to download your unicorn pillow pattern, you'll also find these in the same freebie section. The main pattern piece is a little bit different because it's got a fold line here. This means you fold your fabric, so the finished piece of fabric ends up twice this length. There is also the cutting chart in the instructions that tells you the width and length if you would rather cut using a ruler. So what I've done here is I've got a piece of fabric and I have folded it so that it is folded in half at the end here, and I'm going to line up this fold line here with the edge of the fabric like that, so that I'm not going to cut down that edge, and then that way when I cut around it, it's going to be twice the length. For my horn pattern piece, I'm going to use this gold, very thin piece of fabric. I want to make this a little more sturdy because I don't think this is going to last very long on its own. So what I've done, and this is not in the pattern, this is a bit of a hack, is I've got a piece of medium weight interfacing. It's iron on, which means it's got glue on one side but not on the other. And when I press it on it with an iron, it will glue, that glue will melt and it will stick it to the fabric underneath. Now there's two ways you can do it. I can either cut out both layers at once and then iron them together, or I can cut out this first layer and then stick it to the second layer and then cut her around, and that's what I'm going to do. I've given this a press, and as you can see, it is just sealed to it and it's now glued down, and I'm going to cut around and that will be my horn piece. The The last pieces to cut out is my nose, my 2 eyelashes and my 2 inner ears. Now, because all of these are little pieces that are not finished on the edges, I'm going to use something called double-sided interfacing to stick them to the felt, and then I've decided I'm going to use the gold for the nose, so I'm going to stick it to the gold as well. So I'll show you how we use this. If you have not used it before, hopefully you will love it. I think it's fantastic. I'm using a brand called Heat and Bond, but Heat and Bond I think it is, but there is numerous different ones and they come in different weights. You can use any weight for this. I'm using a lightweight Heat and Bond, which comes out about similar to a medium weight interfacing. The first thing to do is to trace these pieces. You can either trace them from on top if you've cut around them like the inner ear, or from underneath if you haven't. You need 2 of the inner ear, 2 of the nose and 2 of the eyelashes. Remember, you will need a left eyelash and a right eyelash. So I have just traced around the back side of the eyelash pattern piece so that I can see through it. If you don't trace around it, it can be a little bit hard to see through when you turn it over to trace. So now I've got a left eyelash and a right eyelash. Now there is no need to cut all the way close around these. You can cut relatively roughly around them. I'm going to make my hearts slightly bigger than the pattern pieces. You don't need to do that. So I'm going to leave a bit of space around, but I just thought that was quite a nice little hack to try for this one. So the next thing we do is we're now going to iron these to the fabric we're using. Make sure the glue side is down. To attach the eyes and the nose to the unicorn. This is the unicorn piece underneath, and I've placed one of the pieces of fabric over the top of it. I've got a disappearing fabric marker here. You can also use tailor's chalk. What we're going to do is we're going to mark on the piece of fabric where the eyes and the nose go. So I'm not going to draw the whole outline, because then when I place my eyes and my nose on top, it may or may not cover it, and I want to make sure it covers it. This is a disappearing marker, which means it will wash off, or it will just disappear. But sometimes they don't come off as well as you're expecting, and sometimes tailor's chalk gets everywhere. And I'm going to draw a line in the middle of where this eyelash goes. Not around the outside edges, but in the middle. And I'm not going to bother doing all of these little bits. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the main curve, and then I'm going to draw the bit that comes out. So that way I know to place the eyelash over the top of that, and the rest of it will line up fine. And then with the nose, I'm not going to draw the whole heart. I'm going to draw a little line between the top of the heart and the bottom of the heart. Once I've done that, I'm going to take this off and turn my pattern piece over, and I might find I have to trace them in order to be able to see through. We are going to put the eyelash and the little heart nose piece on now. You can also embroider these if you prefer. So I've taken the paper backing off, and then I'm going to place the correct eyelash directly on top of these lines, and I'm then going to go to my iron, and I'm going to iron that, or press that on, and do the same with my little heart here. And I'm going to do the same on both of the head pieces, so my left head piece and my right head piece. And once they are pressed on so that they're glued down, I will then change the thread in my sewing machine so that it matches it, and stitch that on. do the ears in terms of sewing first. You'll find there are 4 outer ear pieces and 2 inner ear. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the 2 inner ear on top of 2 of the outers, and then we'll stitch them right sides together and turn them through. Now, as I mentioned before, these inner ear pieces are not finished on the edge, so we're just going to sew them down like that. If you don't have double-sided interfacing like I've put on mine, you could just turn the edges under and then stitch, but because I've got the double-sided interfacing, I'm going to use that. So the way it works is you peel off the paper back, and then now you can see this has got a shiny glue surface here, and I'm going to place it on top of my outer ear right in the middle. So my outer ear is right side up, and then I'm going to press that on with my iron. Then I will leave it to cool down before I sew, and then I'm going to sew around the edge, and I'm going to repeat that for both of these ears. I've stitched along these edges here to hold them down. I haven't bothered along the bottom because that is going to get sewed into the unicorn itself. Now I'm going to take my other ear pieces and place them right side down on top of here, and then you can either use clips or pins. I'm going to use my pins here, but you can use clips as well to hold these together, and then we're going to stitch around the 2 outside edges. We are going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this. That's quite small. You can use a larger one if you want, but you'll find that everything ends up slightly smaller by doing that. So I'm going to back stitch here, stitch along, turn at the end, stitch back, and back stitch there, and I'm going to do that for both ear pieces. Now I've got your 2 ear pieces stitched together and the inner ear inside. We're going to reduce a bit of bulk before we turn it through by clipping off the top of the triangular part of the ear. If you have quite a bulky fabric, you might also need to clip a few little notches into the seam allowance, or use pinking shears to trim that seam allowance and tidy it up in order to turn it through without any bulk. Once you've done that, my fabric's quite thin. I'm using a quilting cotton, so I don't need to. We are going to turn this through and get it all the way out. Now what you might find you need to do is use something to poke through this top end to make it a nice point. I've got some little tweezers here. You could also use a knitting needle or some chopsticks. I would avoid trying to use scissors though to get that point through, because it can make a hole. Then once we've done that with both of them, what we want to do is press it so that the edges are nice and neatly pressed out. Optionally, if you want to, you can top stitch around the outside edge to hold them out, or you can leave it as is. Now that I've pressed these edges, I haven't top stitched around here because I don't want to, but if you did, you could do that. Then fold each ear in half with the inner ear piece inside, and pin or clip that in place. And then what we're going to do is stitch down this edge here, and we're going to do what's called basting. Now this is a stitch that will not be seen in the final unicorn, so you can use a long loose stitch so that you can pull it out again afterwards, and do it at about 1/4 inch away from the edge. Or if you're confident with stitching close to the edge, you could just use a regular stitch and stitch inside that 1/4 inch seam allowance so that it gets hidden in the final one. That's what I'm going to do because it's easiest. So I'm going to stitch really close to the edge using a normal stitch to hold these so that they are in the ear shape. We're going to be attaching the ear now, so or both ears, so you will need your pattern piece, and you will need your main body piece, and then you'll need your ears. So the way we do this is we're going to put them so that they're facing down into the body, not up, and that way all of the seams can be stitched together when we stitch them together. And in terms of placement, you'll find a little notch here that says ear. The earpiece is going to be centered over the top of that. You will notice that the top is curved, the earpiece is straight, so it will not sit perfectly, and that's fine. If you can, try and curve it around as you attach it, because it does help hold the earpiece straight up. But if you can't, that's fine, we can trim those bits off. It just depends how stiff this is, because it is quite a lot of layers of fabric. So we're going to try and attach it slightly curved like that. So I'm going to pin the ear to here, and then I'm going to stitch it using a 1/4 inch basting stitch again. Make sure that the inner ear is facing towards the front, and the part where there's no inner ear is facing towards the back. To do the mane next. Now in the pattern you'll find that there are instructions to put a piece of trim at the top and stitch it so that it is just poking out in the final version like that. I am going to do this with this one, but like I mentioned earlier, I thought I might also do something else. This is optional, this is not in the pattern. I'm going to just eyeball it, stitch it about that far down, knowing that the top little seam allowance will take this bit off there, and I'm just going to stitch this using by eye, using I think probably the seam allowance guides out the side to stitch this on. You can either pin this and baste it down, or you can pin and then put the other piece of fabric on top and sandwich them straight together. I am going to baste it because that's what's in the pattern, and especially with ribbons and trims, they do tend to move around a little bit, so I would much rather know that it hadn't shifted while I was sewing. But if you've got something that doesn't move around and you're feeling quite confident, you could just jump straight to the next step and sandwich this in as you're doing. We are now going to stitch the two main pieces together. So you'll need to place them, if you've done put something on the top here, make sure that the two tops are together, that you've not got it the other way around, and if they're directional, make sure you've got the bit you want to be the outer edge, the top edge at the top. And we are going to clip or pin these together, and then we're going to stitch the short edge, so this is the short edge here, all the way along the top and then down the other short edge as well. Now once you've sewed it, if you find the ends are messy, you can give them a little trim, and then we are going to clip this top corner to make that easy to turn through. And you'll find that the ribbon curls over at the edge, and then the ribbon or rickrack should stay upright the whole time. So pull this ribbon all the way out and give that a good press flat like that now. Now we've got our ribbon and our rickrack either side. The mane is still open at the bottom. If you want to add ribbon to the bottom, what we're going to do is we're going to go all the way along one side and then back down the other. Now when you get back to the beginning, we are going to go past by about an inch, trim the ribbon off, and then I'm going to fold this under here so that that raw edge is hidden. Then when I stitch it, I'm going to stitch all the way along the bottom, but I'm also going to stitch up this little gap here so that that folded ribbon cannot then unravel. Next up, we're going to stitch 2 rows of gathering stitches along the bottom edge of the mane from all the way from one end all the way through to the other. And this is so that we can pull them and it will gather the fabric in like this as we attach it to the actual body. Now you'll notice when I do this, I'm going to use a contrasting colour bobbin thread, and that is because the bobbin thread is the best one to pull on a gathering stitch in order to gather it. If you've got a gathering foot, you might want to use that. If not, you can use this gathering technique. What you need to do is set your sewing machine to the longest stitch. So for me, it's a regular straight stitch, but I increase the length of the stitch. That's how far along it takes to stitch, to 5. For the marking that says mane and fringe up the top here, and we're going to place a little pin in that, or you can mark it using your fabric marker or tailor's chalk. And then we're going to do the same with the marking at the bottom that says mane, and we're going to attach the mane. If we put it facing in like this, so that your whatever the top bit is inwards, when we finish it, it will end up going outwards like that. The first thing to do is to get one end of it and to butt it up against that pin, and we are matching the raw edges along here and the edge of that with the edge of that, and then make sure it's not twisted. Come down to the bottom, and we're going to butt the edge up with that pin there. Now you'll end up with the mane being much bigger than the body, and what we need to do now is gather it. So if you used 2 different coloured threads, make sure to find those. It's a great way to use up leftover threads, and you're going to get both those threads together and gently pull. Now be careful because you've got pins there, and it just takes, if you pull too hard, they'll snap, especially if you've added the ribbon, because you'll have extra layers. But just gently pull, and we're going to gather from both ends until the mane fits the body. So now we've got this all gathered on, we're going to stitch around the edge here. So this is all stitched on now. What we need to do is get rid of these basting stitches because they will be seen in the final unicorn. Now what you can do, if you know that you've got pretty good strong thread, is you can get an unpicker and find roughly in the middle where they are, and then break one of the, make sure it's your coloured bobbin thread, not your main thread, because the bobbin thread is the one that we gathered. And break them, and then it should just from the bottom pull out. If it breaks while you are pulling it out, don't worry, you can just pick it up from wherever it is along. It's part of having the coloured thread, as you can easily find it. We're now going to do the fringe. Now you can have the fringe exactly as is, or you can change it up. It is a curved pattern piece, and you can, I've seen people make it into a big cowlick and do all kinds of crazy things with it. I am going to do a little hack, and I'm going to stitch this leftover rickrack that I have so that it is nearly touching the raw edge, so that then when I stitch the two together, it's going to stick out like that. Pin this around the curved edge, and then I'm going to stitch it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now if you've got a messy seam allowance, or you've stitched too far in, give it a trim around the outside so there's not too much bulk, and then we're going to turn it through. If there are any parts where any trim that you might have added or not added around the outside is too far in or out, then you can unpick or go back over those bits to bring them in a bit. And then we're going to give it a press and top stitch around to hold it. Now I've just top stitched around the edge. As you can see from here, top stitching is where you stitch really close to the edge. I've stitched incredibly close because I wanted to remain on the kind of middle part of the rickrack and not have my presser foot keep slipping off this little lump that's around here now. But usually you would do top stitching at about 1/8 of an inch away from the line that you're lining it up with. Then we're going to do the same gather stitching 2 lines across so that we can gather our fringe up like that. So set the same settings you had before and the same distances of just over 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch. We are going to gather up our fringe now. If you get your 2 bobbin threads from either end and give them a bit of a pull. There's no particular width that has to be gathered up to. I like to go kind of as tight as I can so that it's all coming from nearly one place. This marking where the mane stopped, that's what we're going to be putting this onto. You can centre over it or you can just go a little bit over it. I'm going to go just a little bit over it because we've still got the horn to attach, and all of this adds bulk. So I'm going to make sure this is as kind of tightly gathered as I can get it to be close to this little marking, and you're placing your mane going into the head or into the body. And then I'm going to stitch that on and remove my basting stitches again. Got our mane here stitched on, our fringe. I'm going to pull those 2 bobbin threads there, and then if I find the 2 top threads, they should just pull right off, and then I won't have any gathering stitches in the final unicorn. Next up, we're going to do the horn. If you want to do the twirling bit of cord or thread around it, then get that now and make sure you don't cut it yet because we don't know quite how much we're going to need, but then have it align it to this little wedge that's cut out the top of the horn and have it sticking about 1 inch out of the top or a little bit more, and then we're going to stitch back and forth a few times to hold it there. Now we're going to keep the rest of this cord out of the way, and we're going to fold the horn right sides together. And we're going to pin it down this long straight edge, and you should find that with the little wedge cut out of the top, as we stitch down the side seam, it'll come to a point at the top. Then we are going to turn it through. So if you fold these 2 straight edges together, and then we're going to stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance down here. Make sure that this cord is out of the way, it's not coming up here and getting stuck in the seam at all. Now we're going to put our horn together. We need to turn it through first. You shouldn't need to trim this top edge because it was squared off. And if you need to, you can use this little cord to help pull it through, but don't pull it too far because you don't want that to come off. That needs to be attached. Once it's all the way out, if you want to, you can give that a press. I find with this particular fabric, a bit of a finger press is fine, and then once you've stuffed it, that should even out anyway. But if you've got particularly stubborn fabric, give that a little press down there. And then you need to get something to stuff your horn with. You're not going to stuff it really, densely, because it's going to be a flat horn like I showed you at the beginning. Now this is, you can stuff it with anything you like, old fabric scraps, the inside of an old pillow, old duvet. I often use old fabric scraps for it. Make sure to poke all the way up into that horn and just not too densely. This here though is some batting that I had for when I was making some coats. And this is just what's left over, so I'm going to use this. So this is actually fresh new batting, or polyfill I think it's also called. So I've threaded a needle here with a thread that's similar colour to my cord, and I've threaded it through the needle, so it goes, oh, it's hard to see, all the way through, and then I've got the two tail ends together and I have tied them in a little knot at the bottom. Now you can twist, pin it all on and then start sewing it from the bottom, but I'm going to do it from the top with this one. And I could just attach the thread at the top, or you can hide it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle in part way down the horn and bring it up at the top where I want to start sewing. Whoops, I've got it caught. And if I pull this through, and I just keep pulling it all the way through until it reaches the fabric. So it's hard to see because it's all the same colour, but this is my little knot here. And I'm allowing, if I pull the thread out the top, I'm allowing the knot to come to the fabric, and then if I give it just a slight little pull, that knot goes inside. If I yank it too hard, it'll come all the way out the top, but I've yanked it just enough to have it come out the top, but not come all the way out. And now what I'm going to do, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is I'm going to now start sewing my cord to my horn, and there's a lot of different bits of thread here, thread and cord, and I'm just gonna kind of loop my thread around to hold it in place, and I'm going to sew all the way to the bottom and then knot it off. And once I can see where my cord goes to, I can trim the end of my cord as well. Now, as I sew the knot in here, I am making sure that I stitch straight through my cord so that it doesn't slip out when I then let go of it, because I want this to be attached, whereas I've been stitching around my cord to hold it on versus like really hold it in. So I'm now making a couple of loops that I'll then go back through so that then I can get it to tie off, and then when that's secure I can cut my thread, and then I'm going, oh, there's a pin, and then I'm going to not cut my cord too close. I'm going to leave it with a little tail. Now, something you can do if you want to is undo one of the pins. Whoops, not that one though. Undo one of the pins that's somewhere in the middle, and tuck the cord inside the horn, and then that way you're definitely not going to lose that bit, and then you can pin it back up. And now we're going to stitch across here, baste it or stitch it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to hold that all in place. So we've now got our horn and our unicorn head. The fringe is there, the mane is there, and there's an ear underneath. And then now we want to put the horn. I like to place it directly over the fringe. It means that you're not trying to get the horn over the ear as well. There's so much bulk to sew through later. So I'm going to pin this on and then stitch it in place. Now we've got our assembled unicorn. We just have to put the two pieces together. So if you place one of them right side up and the other one right side down on top of it, and we want to pin or clip all the way around. Doing the bulkiest bits is really quite tricky, so start with one of the easier areas, and I would use a lot of pins for this. I am guilty of sewing quite often without using any pins at all and just winging it. This is not the time to do that. Use loads of pins and go from several different places to make sure it's well lined up, because it's really hard to lay flat and know that you've got it even around the whole thing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to leave a gap at the bottom of about 5 inches. And I like to donate, I'm not quite sure how to say that, to mark this by doing a double pin either side of where I'm going to be stopping, and that way I don't actually stitch along that. So we are going to be stitching all the way around this. Now the pattern does call for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That is quite tricky over the main. So if you cannot do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, if you find yourself doing about a 1/2 inch seam allowance, that's totally fine. The other thing is I recommend going over your seam twice. So once we've pinned this and then we then go to actually sew it, I recommend sewing it twice. Once on the seam allowance, so at that kind of 1/4 to 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then another time inside that, so that the stitching is held really well together. Now, when you get to actually sewing this, it's going to be very thick over the ears, particularly. If you find, go very, very slow. Do not speed over this. Do not run over any pins as well. Make sure to take the pins out as you sew. And if you think it's going to be too thick for your machine, there's a couple of ways to deal with it. One is to place it between two towels or two kitchen towels, and to give it a bit of a bash with a hammer. That will sounds ridiculous, but it will break the threads, and it breaks the threads down and it does flatten it. It's the same. It's I think it's called clapping when you do it on jeans, and it helps those really thick seams so that you can sew through them. Another option, if you've got it, is to use a walking foot and go incredibly slowly. Another option is to use the hand reel on the side of your machine rather than the pedal. That allows you to control the needle as it goes down so that you don't break it. Do not just sew normal at a normal speed over this bit, because you will almost certainly break it, and that can be a bit dangerous. See how thick that is? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the hand crank, so the round thing on the side of the machine, to make my needle go up and down, and if my needle cannot take it, I will sew that bit by hand. Now pinned unicorn, and you can see how much I've pinned through here. Make sure that there are no kind of folds in the fabric. We are going to sew starting at the bottom, and you can go, doesn't matter which direction you go, but back stitch here, and then go up and around and down, and then back stitch again. To clip into these stitches around the neck to allow us to turn it through. You want to be careful to snip just a little bit into the seam allowance and not cut your stitches. If, like me, you've done 2 rows of stitching, then you're going to be able to clip less in. You can always come back and clip more if you need to once you've turned it through, but give it a shot first. And what this does is, as you can see, it opens the seam allowance up and allows you to get a really nice finish around that neck edge there. Now, you don't need to press this once it comes through. It should all just fill out once you put the stuffing into it, but do make sure that all of the seams are folded through. If you need to, you can turn it back and clip any other seam allowances to make it sit nicely, or you can use pinking shears and trim, or just regular scissors and trim the seam allowance to make it turn through easier. Once you've done that, we're then going to stuff it. It depends how full you want it. If you're going to be using it as a pillow, then don't put too much stuffing in, which is what our plan is. But if you're going to be using it as a toy, you can stuff it fuller. So I want mine kind of still quite squishy. And then so get it all the way so that it's stuffed full, and then we're going to pin that closed like we did before. So now we need to seal this bottom edge. If you want to, you could just machine stitch along here. I like to have any kind of sealing stitches like this hidden, so I'm going to do it with a needle and thread. I've done the same thing as before, where I've threaded the needle through, and then I've brought the two ends together and made a little knot with it. So I'm going to come in from partly in from somewhere else in the unicorn, and I'm going to bring it out just by this by where it starts here, and do the same thing of pulling, and then you can see the little knot there, and I'm just going to yank it through so it's now inside the cushion somewhere, my tail. And what I want to do is I'm going to stitch using a ladder stitch, or you might call it a slip stitch. It's where you stitch along, straight down, along, straight down, along, straight down, along, straight down, or up. Anyway, you end up with these ladder rungs along, and then when you pull it tight, the whole thing just disappears, and it's like it's got tiny little stitches all the way along, but the along bits are hidden in the two sides of of where you're stitching. So there's a few different ways you can do it. How I'm going to do it is I'm going to go along, and I'm going to bring my needle out, and I'm going to pull that all the way through, and then I'm going to start directly opposite where that came out on the other side, and I'm going to take it along, and I'm not going very far. There we go. And if I just loosen that off so you can see it, that makes a straight across stitch. And then if I go directly across and along, I've got another straight little stitch like that. So now this is starting to make my ladder rungs, and I'm going to continue all the way along, pull it tight, and make a knot. Right, the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to put the needle in close to the knot, and I'm going to take it out somewhere in the unicorn. So then this hides the thread, so you can't see the thread on the bottom there. And if I give it a very slight pull, and then I snip it, the tail will disappear into the body, and you cannot see the tail anymore. And then I just need to move my stuffing closer to where I've just sewn. Now, if you want to, this fringe sticks up and out, so I like to attach it to the front of the unicorn's or horse's face, but it's up to you whether you'd like to do that. If you do, needle and thread again with a knot in the end, and I'm going to take it, in fact I might do the same thing I did before actually. Start somewhere in the unicorn's body, pull the knot so that it's pops through. There we go. And now the knot is against the back side of the fabric there. And then I'm going to pull this fringe down, and I'm just going to stitch that to the body a couple of times and make a knot. This is the finished unicorn pillow. It is quite, it's not that thick, so it's quite a good sort of little novelty pillow. Obviously not a real pillow for them, but a novelty pillow for a little child. That's what we'll be using it for. Or you might have stuffed it thicker and have it more like a stuffed toy. There it is the same on both sides, other than the fringe comes one side of the horn. If you're going to make more of them, all kinds of fun hack ideas on our Facebook group. If you search Rebecca Page Sewing on Facebook and then go in and have a search for unicorn pillows, you'll see all kinds of really exciting things that people have made. You can customize the mane however you want it, as you might have guessed, the little nose, the eyes. Seen people do embroidery, all different kinds of colors and fabric types, the horn, no horn, different shapes. You get the idea. So I hope you have fun with this pattern, and do come and share in the group and let us know what you've made.